temporary residential lease form for the buyers, meaning that the buyer is going to occupy the property no more than 90 days prior to the closing. So this is when you'll use this form. Highly recommend not doing any types of lease backs. I've warned you against these, and you need to tell your client of the possible ramifications that could happen if you do such a thing. For example, this person is moving in prior to buying it. What if they move in and start buying furniture and all of a sudden they are not qualified for the loan anymore and the lender cannot loan on it? Now you got a tenant in here. So highly recommend against this. But sometimes you might find yourself needing it, knowing the repercussions. Here's how to do it. The party of the lease are, and the first blank is the landlord, which would be the seller's name. So you put the seller's names here. And the second one is the tenant. So you'll put which would be the buyer, because they're the ones moving in and going to be occupying the property before closing, because they don't own it. They will be known as the tenant. So you'll put their name there. The second one says landlord lease to tenant the property described in the contract between landlord and seller, and tenant is known as, you're going to put the full address here. As you can see, that right there gives you a hint. We're going to put the address in this box. City, state, zip code, all that in there. And now we talk about term. The term of the lease commences. This is when you're going to allow them to move in. The day, like if they close on the 24th, you let them move in on the 13th. That's what you're going to put in terms as specified in paragraph 18. Well, paragraph 18 is down here. We'll get to it. This lease terminates upon closing and funding of sale of the contract. B, termination of contract prior to closing, or tenant defaults on the lease, or tenant defaults under the contract, whichever occurs first. Upon termination other than by closing and funding of the sale, tenant shall surrender possession of the property. So it kind of clears that up. Let's talk about rent. Rent will be, and you can put whatever, you want to put an amount. It's negotiable, how much per day. What I like to do is look at the local hotels or day places where you can, day hotels, motels, see what their daily rate is. Maybe something around that, maybe less, whatever. I like to keep it close to it because if possible, why not just go there instead of staying in the house? But it's just what it is. But you guys can negotiate that. That's between the buyer and the seller, right? Especially the seller, since they're the ones leasing it back. Upon commencement of this lease, seller shall pay the landlord the full amount of whatever that is per day for anticipation term of the lease commencement date on the closing date specified in paragraph 9 of the contract. If the actual term of the lease differs from the anticipated term, and an additional rent or reimbursement will be paid at closing. No portion of the rent will be applied to payment of any type covered by this contract. Now let's talk about deposit. Tenant has paid to landlord. This is where you can put like a security deposit in, okay? This is again up to the determination of the seller and the landlord to come to an agreement on that amount. But you do understand this is, if this lease is terminated before the closing date, landlord may use the deposit to satisfy tenant's obligation under the lease terms. Landlord shall refund the tenant any unused portion of the deposit together with itemized list of all deductions from the deposit within 30 days after tenant surrenders the property, and provide landlord with a written notice of tenant's forwarding address. If the lease is terminated by the closing and funding of the sale of the property, the deposit will be refunded to the tenant at closing and funding. So notice the deposit must be in additional to the earnest money under the contract, okay? Utilities shall tenants shall pay all utilities, and except for whatever. You guys, if there's anything that the landlord's gonna pay, you put that there. If not, you're gonna pay non-applicable. We ain't paying none, you stand there, you pay for all of it, generally, right? But there may be some things, I don't know, pool guy, something that they might want to maintain. Tenant may use the property only for residential use. Tenant may not assign this lease or sublease any part of this property. Also, any pets, no pets, except for, and you'll put the exception of the pets that you're allowing them to have at the property. Condition of the property. Tenant accepts the property in its present condition and state of repair, but landlord shall make any repairs, any improvements required by the contract. If the lease is terminated prior to the contract, tenant shall surrender possession of the property to landlord in its present condition as improved by landlord, except normal wear and tear and casualty and loss. Any alterations, tenant may not make any holes, drive nails, or woodwork, wood floors. They can't do anything, ceilings, alteration, painting, decoration, just install improvement fixtures without prior written consent of the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease becomes part of the property, okay? Leave it alone until you completely own and close, then you start doing your repairs. If you do, you risk possibly losing your money in the equity and time that you put into it. Special provisions there. Inspection. Landlord may enter at a reasonable time to inspect, replace, repair, or complete the improvements. Tenants shall provide landlord door keys to the door, access codes to allow access during the property during the terms of the lease. Law. Tenants shall comply with any applicable laws, restrictions, ordinance, rules, and regulations with respect to the property. Repairs and maintenance, except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenants shall bear all expenses of repairs, replacement, and maintenance of the property, including but not limited to the yard, shrubbery, all equipment, appliances otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenants shall promptly repair tenants shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damages to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of tenant or any person other than the tenant, landlords, agents, or invitees. Okay. So you're going to make sure to have everybody initial the bottom of this page and the very top of this one. You're going to also put the address of the property. And we're going to get into indemnities. Tenant indemnifies the landlord from the claim of all third parties for injury or damage to the persons or property such third party arises. The use of occupancy of the property by the tenant. This indemnifies includes attorney fees, costs, and expenses incurred by the landlord. Insurance. Landlord and tenant shall each maintain their own insurance, in other words. Consult your insurance agent. Possession of the property by buyer as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. You see that's all capital. It's very important to kind of talk to your insurance provider about that. Default, I think we went over that. If tenant fails to perform or observe any provision of this lease and fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and due diligence pursue to rectify such failure, tenant will be in default. They got 24 hours once they're notified that they're in default to make some kind of make it right, or they'll be in default. This lease terminates upon closing funding of the sale of the property, or B, termination of the contract prior to closing, or C, tenant defaults under the lease, or D, tenant defaults under the contract, whichever occurs first. Upon termination other than by closing and funding, tenant shall surrender possession to the property. Holdover tenant. This is where I want this to be nasty. Hey, if they are not out by when they're supposed to be, or if they don't close, it forms a tenancy and sufferance, and you want to be a per day. That's really nasty. $500 per day. Something very much so. Depending on where you are, you need to make sure it's above the average, so it hurts them. If they shouldn't have a problem signing something so big, because if they're planning on being out, we shouldn't have a problem with you doing this. Attorney's fees. The prevailing party in any legal proceeds, pretty much winner pays for everything, right? Smoke alarms. The Texas Property Code requires landlords to install smoke alarms in certain locations within the property at landlord's expense, but the tenant expressly waives landlord's duty to inspect and repair the smoke alarms. Devices. The requirement of the Texas property related to security devices do not apply to a residential lease for terms of 90 days or less, guys. Landlord, floodplain, disorder. If it's in a floodplain notice, we still have to get that notice. That's the name of it. TREC note 50, 54-0. You can get that if it's in the floodplain. Then you have to get that notice. Bottom line, real estate licensees cannot give legal advice. This lease is This lease is intended to be legally binding. Read carefully. If you do not understand the effects of this lease, consult your attorney before signing. All legal notices from one party to another must be in writing and effective when mailed to, hand delivered, transmitted by that's fax or electronic submission as following. So you want to make sure you have the addresses here to the landlord and the tenant and their phone numbers there, or an email, at least 2 forms of contacts here, okay? And not you, the real estate agent's contact information. The very bottom, landlord's gonna sign, tenant's gonna sign. But that is there for the buyer's temporary residential lease form. If you have any questions, let me know.